The rain hit the windshield in slow, rhythmic taps, but it wasn't the sound that kept her awake. It was the cold. It seeped through the cracked window seal, through the thin blanket bunched around her shoulders, through skin that hadn't felt warm in weeks. 20 years old, and this was her bedroom now. A rusted Honda Civic parked behind a shuttered laundromat, engine off to save the last quarter tank of gas. She hadn't planned for this. Nobody plans for this. 6 months ago she had a name that meant something, at least to her. A small business, a shared apartment, a man who said he loved her enough to put both their names on everything. Then the debts came due and he disappeared, taking what was left of the money and leaving her holding contracts she never fully understood. Her parents hadn't spoken to her since the eviction notice. Pride, they called it. Consequences, they said. She called it abandonment, but no one was listening anymore. Her phone battery blinked red, 4%. She had $11, a duffel bag of clothes, and a shame so heavy it sat behind her ribs like a stone. She thought about calling someone. There was no one left to call. That was when she saw it, tucked under the wiper of a car 2 spaces down, flapping wet in the wind. A faded yellow flyer. Storage unit auction. Unclaimed contents. Cash only. Today 10 a.m. She almost let it blow away. Almost. But something in her, some last stubborn ember refusing to go out, made her reach through the gap in the window and pull it free. She stared at the address until the ink blurred with rain, and for the first time in weeks, felt something other than despair. It wasn't hope exactly. It was just enough to make her start the engine. The storage facility sat behind a gas station on the edge of town, rows of corrugated metal doors baking under a pale morning sun. A small crowd had gathered by the time she arrived. Maybe 15 people, clustered in 2s and 3s, holding coffee cups and clipboards like this was just another Tuesday. She counted her cash twice in the car. $230. Everything she had left in the world, folded into a rubber band. The others didn't look like her. A heavy-set man in a polo shirt joked with the auctioneer by name. A woman in sunglasses scrolled her phone between bids, barely glancing up at the units, like she was killing time between appointments. This was a hobby to them. A side hustle. Pocket change if a bid went wrong. For her, it was everything. Unit after unit sold. Furniture, electronics, boxes that promised jewelry or antiques. Bids climbed into the hundreds, sometimes thousands. She stayed silent, throat tight, watching her only chance slip further away with every raised hand. Then the auctioneer moved to the last unit of the day. Number 114. No one leaned forward. No visible boxes through the gap in the door, just a shadowed clutter of shapes and dust. Owner deceased, the auctioneer said flatly. No next of kin on file. Contents unknown. Nobody bid. She raised her hand before she could talk herself out of it. $50. Pause. A shrug from the crowd. The auctioneer's gavel came down almost lazily. Sold. She barely breathed as she signed the paper, hands trembling, not from the cold this time, but from something sharper. A stranger's forgotten life now belonged to her. And she had no idea what she'd just bought. She waited until dark to open it. Not out of superstition, she told herself that anyway, but because the daylight crowd had made her feel small, and she didn't want an audience for whatever waited behind that metal door. The facility was empty now, lit only by a flickering security lamp that buzzed like a dying insect. The padlock gave way with a rusted groan. She lifted the door and it screamed on its tracks, exhaling a breath of stale, trapped air, dust, old paper, faint mildew, and underneath it all, something like cedar. Like a life once lived. Her flashlight swept across the space. A worn armchair, sagging in the middle. Stacks of yellowed newspapers. A roll-top desk with one drawer hanging open, empty. Cardboard boxes sealed with brittle tape, some collapsing under their own weight. Nothing valuable. Nothing that explained why a man would pay to store it for years. She almost turned to leave. Then her flashlight caught something odd. A floorboard beneath the desk, slightly raised, its edges too clean, too deliberate against the warped wood around it. Her pulse quickened. She knelt, fingers brushing over dust until she found the seam. It lifted easily like it had been opened many times before. Underneath sat a small wooden box, its lid secured with a tarnished brass lock, and beside it, a sealed envelope. No name, no stamp, just her own breath catching in her throat as she read the single word written across the front in careful, deliberate ink. Don't. She stared at it for a long moment, the silence of the unit pressing in around her. Whatever this man had hidden, he hadn't wanted it found. So why did it feel like it was waiting for her? She sat cross-legged on the concrete floor, the wooden box and the envelope set carefully aside for now, and began working through the rest of the unit by flashlight. It felt wrong somehow, like trespassing in a life that wasn't hers to touch, but curiosity had already taken root, and there was no pulling it out. The first box held photographs, dozens of them, curling at the edges. A younger version of a man she'd never met, standing in front of buildings that looked important. Marble columns, brass nameplates, the kind of architecture reserved for people with money and influence. In one photo, he stood beside a woman in an elegant coat, both of them smiling like they hadn't a worry in the world. In another, he wore a suit that looked tailored, a watch on his wrist that even she, with no expertise, could tell wasn't cheap. This didn't match the file at the auction. Owner deceased. No next of kin. Contents unknown. That was the language of a forgotten man, someone who'd slipped through the cracks alone. But these photographs told a different story, of status, of connection, of a life that had once mattered to someone. She found letters next, tied with string gone brittle with age. The handwriting was elegant, urgent in places, the ink smudged like it had been written quickly, or perhaps through trembling hands. She could only make out fragments, a name blotted out, the words if they find it repeated more than once, and a date circled twice in red near the bottom of the last page. A chill moved through her that had nothing to do with the cold concrete beneath her. Whoever this man had been, he wasn't the nobody the auction house had described. He'd been running from something, hiding from someone. And whatever secret he carried to his grave, he'd left just enough behind for her to start pulling at the thread. Her hands were unsteady as she finally lifted the lid of the wooden box. The lock had rusted just enough to give way under pressure, splintering the old wood around the hinge. Inside, nestled in a bed of faded velvet, sat a single brass key, worn smooth from years of handling, and beneath it, folded into quarters, a document that made her breath catch. It was a deed. Property records, stamped with a seal she didn't recognize, listing an address 3 states away. But it wasn't the property that stopped her cold, it was the name typed beside owner. It wasn't the name from the auction file. It wasn't the name on the mailbox outside this very unit. It was someone else entirely. She sat back against the cold wall, mind racing. Had this man been living under a different identity? Had he stolen this deed, or was the version of him at the auction, forgotten, unclaimed, alone, the fake one? The photographs, the tailored suits, the woman in the elegant coat, none of it fit the picture of a man who died with no one to claim him. She turned to the sealed envelope last, hands trembling as she broke the wax. Inside was a single page, the handwriting rushed, almost frantic compared to the careful script on the letters. If you're reading this, I'm already gone. There isn't much time. What's buried here was never meant to stay buried. Not from you, not from anyone still looking. Find it before they do. Before it's too late. She read it 3 times, the words settling into her chest like stones. Before who does? Before what is too late? Whatever this man had been running from, it hadn't ended with his death. And now, whether she wanted it or not, she was standing in the middle of it. She didn't sleep that night. She sat in her car with the deed, the key, and the letter spread across the passenger seat, reading the frantic warning over and over until the words lost their shape. Before they do. Before it's too late. Who was they? And how could a man 3 years dead still have people looking for something he'd hidden? By morning, exhaustion had dulled the fear into something quieter, more manageable. She told herself it was nothing. Old paranoia written by a dying man, nothing more. She drove back to the storage facility to collect the rest of the unit's contents, needing daylight and normalcy to steady herself. That was when she saw the car. A dark sedan parked at the far end of the lot, engine idling despite the empty rows around it. She might not have noticed at all, except the man behind the wheel wasn't looking at his phone, or eating breakfast, or doing any of the ordinary things people do while waiting. He was watching the office. Watching her unit. She kept her head down and walked inside, pulse hammering, trying to look like someone who belonged there. The manager behind the desk beat her to the conversation. "Funny," he said, barely looking up from his paperwork. "Somebody called here yesterday asking about Unit 114. Wanted to know who bought it. Wouldn't leave a name." The pen in her hand stilled. "Did you tell him?" He shrugged, unbothered. "Told him it sold. That's all I know." She thanked him too quickly and walked back out into the lot, forcing her steps slow and even. The sedan was gone by the time she reached her car, but the unease it left behind wasn't. Someone knew the unit had sold. Someone wanted to know who to. And for the first time since this began, she understood. This wasn't just a mystery she'd stumbled into. It was one she'd been pulled into. She spent the next 2 days in the corner of a public library, the only warm, well-lit place she had left, feeding coins into an old microfilm machine and scrolling through decades of local archives. She started with the name from the deed, the one that didn't match the auction file, and within an hour she understood why someone had wanted this buried. The headlines came in fragments at first. A financial firm, mid-sized, respected once. A name that matched the man in the tailored suits, listed as a founding partner. Then, 7 years ago, everything unraveled. Accusations of missing funds, investors left with nothing, a partner who vanished before charges could be filed. The articles called him a fraud. A ghost. Some speculated he'd fled the country. Others believed he was dead long before the storage unit ever existed. But the photographs in his unit told her he hadn't fled anywhere glamorous. He'd been hiding 2 towns over, under a new name, living quietly enough that even the auction house had no idea who he really was. She found one more article buried on a back page, dated only months before his death. A single investor, an elderly woman, had lost her life savings in the collapse and later died in poverty, her family blaming the vanished partner by name, the very name typed on the deed in her hands. Her stomach turned. This wasn't just a hidden identity. It was a debt left unpaid, a wound left open, people who had lost everything because of decisions this man made. And if the deed was real, if the property it pointed to held what she suspected, money, assets, proof of where the missing funds had gone, then whoever was watching her wasn't chasing a forgotten storage unit. They were chasing whatever was left of a fortune stolen from people who never got justice. She wasn't just holding a stranger's secret anymore. She was holding the key to somebody else's ruin, or somebody else's redemption. The knock came just after 9, sharp and deliberate against the thin motel door she'd rented with the last of her cash. She froze, the wooden box already hidden beneath a loose floorboard she'd pried up herself, mimicking the dead man's own instinct to bury what mattered. Through the peephole stood a man in an expensive coat, calm in a way that felt rehearsed. She opened the door only as far as the chain allowed. "You bought Unit 114, he said, no greeting, no pretense. "I represent a party interested in its contents. We're prepared to offer you $15,000. Tonight. Cash. $15,000. More money than she'd seen in her entire life, dangled in front of her like bait on a hook. 3 days ago she would have said yes before he finished the sentence. But 3 days ago she hadn't read a dying man's warning, hadn't seen a widow's name buried in a newspaper archive, hadn't understood that somewhere out there, people were still paying for what this stranger had done. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, voice steadier than she felt. His pleasant expression thinned. "Don't make this difficult. That unit and everything in it was never really yours to keep. You got lucky at an auction. That's all this is. Then why offer me money for something that isn't mine?" Something shifted behind his eyes, something colder. "20,000. Final offer. After tonight, I can't promise the next conversation will be this civil." The threat sat plainly between them, no longer hidden beneath politeness. Her hands trembled at her sides, every instinct screaming at her to hand over the box and disappear, to take the money and finally breathe. But she thought of the letter. Find it before they do. She thought of the old woman who died with nothing while this man's partner built a new life under a stolen name. "I don't have it anymore," she lied, meeting his eyes despite the fear clawing up her throat. He studied her for a long moment, then turned and walked back into the dark, leaving her certain of one thing. This wasn't over. She didn't sleep in the motel again. By dawn she was 3 towns over, sitting across from a woman named Diane Ferris, a retired financial journalist whose byline she'd found on half the old fraud articles, still listed in a local directory like she'd been waiting 7 years for someone to finally ask the right questions. Diane listened without interrupting, her coffee going cold as she studied the deed, the photographs, the frantic letter laid across her kitchen table. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of someone who'd carried this story alone for too long. "I always believed he didn't act by himself," Diane said. "The money that vanished, it wasn't just clever accounting. Someone with real power helped him disappear it and helped him disappear afterward. I chased that story until my editor pulled me off it. Too many important names attached." She tapped the deed. "This address, I recognize it. It's tied to a holding company that never made sense on paper. Shell inside a shell. If there's a ledger in that unit, real records instead of what the courts were shown, it wouldn't just clear his name from being a lone wolf. It would expose whoever helped him." The pieces clicked into place with a force that stole her breath. The man in the storage unit hadn't hidden the fortune to enjoy it. He'd hidden proof, insurance against the people who'd used him and would have silenced him the moment he became inconvenient. "That's who's looking for it," Diane said quietly. "Not investors wanting their money back. People protecting themselves." The danger she'd sensed in the motel doorway suddenly had a shape, a motive far larger than she'd imagined. This wasn't about one dead man's guilt anymore. It was about people still walking free, still powerful, who needed that ledger buried as deeply as he had. "If we do this," Diane said, meeting her eyes, "we do it carefully. And we do it publicly. It's the only way you'll be safe." For the first time, she wasn't facing this alone. They drove to the property listed on the deed at first light, an old warehouse on the outskirts of a town she'd never heard of, its windows boarded, its lot overgrown with weeds pushing through cracked asphalt. Diane brought a locksmith she trusted, along with a small camera to document everything before they touched a single thing inside. The brass key from the wooden box turned in a side door lock that hadn't been used in years. Inside, beneath decades of dust, sat rows of filing cabinets, untouched, forgotten, exactly where a desperate man had left them before he vanished into a new name and a quieter life. Diane moved through them with practiced urgency, pulling ledgers, bank statements, wire transfer records. The real numbers, never shown to auditors or courts, detailing exactly where the missing fortune had gone. But it was the final drawer that changed everything. Inside sat a single folder, her own name typed across the tab, faded but unmistakable. Her hands shook as she opened it. Inside were documents connecting her, however distantly, to the very investor whose life savings had vanished in the collapse. The elderly woman from the newspaper article, who Diane now revealed, gently, had been her grandmother's closest friend, named as a partial beneficiary in a settlement that had never been paid out. A settlement this man had hidden, along with everything else, perhaps as one final act of guilt before his death. The stolen fortune wasn't just evidence anymore. Some of it was rightfully hers. She sat on the dusty warehouse floor, the folder trembling in her hands, and felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in months. Not fear, not desperation, but the dizzying, disorienting shape of hope. The auction, the storage unit, the $50 that had felt like her last foolish gamble, it hadn't been random at all. Somehow, impossibly, it had led her back to a debt owed to her own family, buried by a man trying, in whatever broken way he could, to make things right before it was too late. "We need to make this public," Diane said quietly, watching her. "Today. Before they know what we found." For the first time, the fear in her chest had a partner. Purpose. They were loading the last of the ledgers into Diane's car when the dark sedan pulled into the warehouse lot, blocking the only exit. 3 men stepped out this time, not just the one in the expensive coat. He walked ahead of the others, all pretense of politeness gone now, his eyes fixed on the boxes in her arms. "You should have taken the money," he said. Diane stepped slightly in front of her, voice sharp and even. "Whatever you think you're about to do, understand that I already emailed copies of everything to 3 editors and a state prosecutor's office 20 minutes ago. Time-stamped. Untraceable to delete." It was a lie. Diane hadn't sent anything yet, there hadn't been time, but her voice didn't waver and neither did her expression. The man's jaw tightened. He glanced at the phone in Diane's hand, calculating, weighing whether the threat was real. "She's bluffing," one of the others muttered. "Am I?" Diane held his gaze without blinking. "Try me. Take the boxes. See how fast this becomes a story about missing evidence and two women assaulted in broad daylight outside a property tied to your employer's shell company. That headline writes itself." The girl felt her pulse roaring in her ears, but she made herself speak, forcing steadiness into her voice she didn't fully feel. "There's also a folder with my name on it, which means I'm not just a witness anymore. I'm a beneficiary. Hurting me doesn't make this disappear, it makes it worse." Silence stretched between them, thick and dangerous. The man's eyes moved from her to Diane, then to the warehouse behind them, calculating exposure, cameras, witnesses, risk. Whatever he'd been sent to do, it hadn't accounted for this, for the story already slipping beyond his control. Finally he stepped back, expression unreadable. "This isn't finished." "It is," Diane said. "You just don't know it yet." They watched the sedan pull away, tires screeching against cracked asphalt, until it disappeared around the bend. Only then did her knees threaten to give out beneath her, adrenaline draining as fast as it had come. Diane touched her shoulder gently. "Now," she said, "we make it true." She pulled out her phone and began typing. The story broke 3 weeks later, splashed across the front page of the same paper that had once buried Diane's original investigation. This time there was no editor to pull her off it, no missing evidence to explain away. The ledgers, the wire transfers, the shell company records, all of it laid out in careful, damning detail, alongside a name the public hadn't heard in 7 years, finally connected to the powerful men who had used him and discarded him once he became a liability. The arrests came within days. Financial fraud charges, conspiracy, obstruction, names attached to boardrooms and country clubs, men who had spent years believing their money made them untouchable. The man in the expensive coat was among them, identified in surveillance footage from the storage facility itself. For the dead man the story shifted too. He was no longer remembered only as a vanished fraud, a name investors cursed at dinner tables. The final chapter of his life told a different truth, that he had spent his last months trying to undo what he'd helped build, hiding evidence not to protect himself, but to eventually expose the people above him, even if it cost him everything. It had. For her, the resolution came quietly, in a courthouse hallway rather than a headline. A settlement, tied to her grandmother's friend and the original victims, recognized her as a rightful partial beneficiary of funds recovered from the shell accounts. It wasn't a fortune large enough to make her reckless. But it was enough to clear her debts, enough to rent an apartment with heat that worked, enough to finally stop counting coins in a gas station parking lot. Diane hugged her outside the courthouse, the winter air sharp but no longer cruel. "You did that," she said. "Not the money. You." She thought of the girl who'd raised her hand for $50, desperate and unseen, betting on a stranger's forgotten life because she had nothing left to lose. That girl hadn't disappeared. She'd simply finally been seen. Spring came slowly that year, but it came. She signed the lease on a small apartment with her own name on it, no one else's, no shared debts hiding behind the ink. The first night, she sat on the floor of an empty living room, sunlight pooling across bare wood, and cried in a way she hadn't allowed herself to since everything fell apart. Not from grief this time, but from something closer to relief. Her mother called in March. Tentative, uncertain, the way people are when too much silence has passed between them. She almost didn't answer. But she thought of the dead man's letter, of secrets kept too long, of what it cost to let pride outlive the people who needed each other. She picked up. They didn't fix everything in one conversation. Some wounds don't close that easily, and she'd learned enough by now not to trust anything that healed too fast. But it was a start, a door left open instead of locked, the way she wished someone had once left one open for her. Diane became something else entirely, not quite family by blood but family by choice, the kind earned through trust rather than obligation. They met for coffee most Sundays, and more than once, Diane mentioned other stories, other injustices worth chasing, as if she'd recognized in her a stubbornness worth keeping close. Financially, she was stable now, not wealthy, but steady in a way that no longer felt fragile. She paid off the last of her old debts in June, closing accounts that had once defined her as a failure, a warning, a cautionary tale whispered at family dinners. But it was the quieter change that mattered most. She no longer flinched when introducing herself, no longer softened her story to make her failures more palatable. She'd been broke, alone, and dismissed, and she'd survived it, clear-eyed and unashamed. That, more than any settlement, felt like the real inheritance. She found his grave in late autumn, tucked in the corner of a modest cemetery 2 towns over, marked only with the false name he'd died under, no dates that meant anything, no family listed, nothing to suggest the storm of truth he'd left buried beneath a warehouse floor. She stood there a long time, leaves gathering at her feet, thinking about how strange it was that a stranger's guilt had become her second chance. He hadn't known her name when he wrote that letter. He couldn't have known that a broke, forgotten 20-year-old would be the one to find what he'd hidden, or that in setting his own conscience right, he'd hand her back a life she thought she'd lost for good. She placed a single stone on the headstone, an old habit she didn't fully understand but felt right in the moment, a quiet acknowledgement that whoever he'd been, whatever he'd done, he'd tried in the end to make it right. "Thank you," she said softly, to no one, to everyone, for not letting it stay buried. Weeks later, she stood in a different kind of lot, not an auction this time, but a small storage facility she now co-owned with Diane, a modest fund set aside specifically for unclaimed units belonging to people who died with no family to claim them. Not for profit. For dignity. A chance for someone else's forgotten life to be seen, honored, understood, rather than sold off in silence to the highest bidder. She thought of the girl in the rusted Honda Civic, $11 in her pocket, certain the world had nothing left to offer her. She hadn't known then that rock bottom could be a beginning. That sometimes the things we assume are worthless, a stranger's forgotten belongings, a life dismissed as nothing, carry within them the exact thing we need to finally become who we were always meant to be.